It was the historic morning of October 12, 1492, when Columbus's ships anchored near a small island called San Salvador. The land last for 11,000 years was discovered. Columbus arrived at the island by boarding a small boat. The indigenous, who are called Taínos, felt as if something new had come down from the skies. They had never seen such a big ship before, and seeing two-legged people like themselves dressed in colorful clothes, they found it all very strange. They themselves wore nominal clothes and lived in grass huts, nor did they have dangerous weapons like Columbus. These people were ignorant of war and conflict. Some of them jumped and boarded their ships. Their behavior was very friendly. They offered Columbus's crew food and colorful parrots of the island as gifts. In response, Columbus's men gave the Taínos colorful hats and iron bells. The indigenous Taínos were happy to ring these bells. Colmbus thought that he had reached near Cipango, Japan. He had read Marco Polo's travelogue, which he mentioned small scattered islands near Cipango, therefore he wanted to travel towards Japan without wasting any time. Columbus noticed some people there with gold rings in their noses, which led him to believe that there is a lot of gold. So he tried to get as much gold as possible from the indigenous before moving on. His men forcibly entered the homes of the indigenous Taínos to search for gold. The indigenous Taínos didn't understand what these people wanted. On the contrary, they were constantly being welcomed. After a few days of brainstorming, when Columbus realized that there is no more gold except for a few rings, he decided to proceed to Japan. He also took some Taínos captive to teach them his language and use them as guides. The indigenous people could not understand Columbus's language, but they did understand some of his gestures and informed him about a nearby large island. These people took Columbus to an island which is now known as Cuba. However, when Columbus reached Cuba on October 28, there was no gold there either. He thought that perhaps he had reached Cathay, that is China. He kept searching for the magnificent cities of China, whose tales he had read in Marco Polo's travelogue. But soon he realized that this was not China either. All of this confused Columbus, because it was neither China nor Japan, and there was no gold. Disappointed, he started searching for the famous Chinese city of Quanzhou on December 5. When Columbus's ships were sailing along the coast of Cuba, the wind began to blow against them, causing them to drift a few hundred kilometers away from Cuba to another island. The devastation that began with Columbus's arrival on this island is still referred to by some historians as the American Holocaust. This is the second largest island in the West Indies, and at that time, its population was around 8 million. Columbus named this island Hispaniola, and he was warmly welcomed here as well. Upon arrival, Columbus thought he might have reached Cipango, Japan, or some other place where he could find a substantial amount of gold. The reason for this was that Columbus's men had seen small gold particles in the island's rivers, and furthermore, a local chief had presented Columbus with a gold mask as a gift. This made Columbus furious. He began to feel that the locals knew about the gold, but were not revealing its source. Columbus decided that he would return to Spain, bring more troops, and scour the entire place to extract the gold. By this time, Columbus's men had already begun to have minor skirmishes with the locals. In one instance, his men killed Taínos because they refused to provide them with arrows. Before leaving, Columbus built a small fort as one of his ships, the Santa Maria, had struck a reef near the coast of Hispaniola and was wrecked. His men used the planks from this ship to construct the fort, which was named Fort Navidad. He stationed 49 men there and sailed back to Spain on January 16, 1493. Columbus took a small amount of gold with him and forcibly enslaved the local Taínos. Half of these slaves died on the way. He brought the remaining slaves to Spain. He declared to the Spanish rulers that he had discovered a new route to Asia, and that there is a lot of gold. He demanded more force, so that he could bring as much gold as possible from there for Spain. The Spanish rulers believed Columbus, and assured him of full support. Colmbus was given the title of the Admiral, and his name began to be mentioned everywhere in the Spain. A fleet of 17 ships was handed over to Columbus. This time, in addition to the crew of 1,300, A number of professional soldiers with guns and swords, and a group of fierce dogs were also included in his squad. When Columbus landed on the coast of Hispaniola, he was shocked. His Fort Navidad had been burned down, and all his men had been killed. The reason was that these Spanish people used to forcibly take the local people's women and children, and abuse them. This had exhausted the patience of the local people. They attacked and killed them all. When Columbus saw the condition of his people, he was furious. He ordered the capture of these people, and the search for gold. By that time the news had spread to all the people of the island that these foreign visitors are not good people, but enemies of their lives. Therefore people started leaving their homes. Despite roaming from village to village, they couldn't find even a trace of gold there. After wandering around the West Indies for 3 years, he started feeling despondent because he hadn't found any gold. To make up for the lack of gold, he thought of using slaves. One day he called all his forces and ordered them to enslave the local people. His soldiers brought back 1,500 people in a single day, out of which 500 were sent to Spain. These slaves were kept in very poor conditions, and 200 of them died on the way. The remaining ones were sold in European markets. However, they too died one by one because they weren't acclimated to the environment there. Columbus had predicted that the business of slave trade would not last much longer, so he thought of using the native Taínos for labor. After that, the local Taínos were put to work in excavation. They were made to dig from the bottom to the top of the mountains, or search for gold in rivers and streams. These local Taínos had to stand bent over all day long. If any local couldn't bring in gold, their hands were cut off, and they were left to bleed until they died. Their women were made to work in agriculture. Due to excessive labor, they lost the ability to bear children. The Europeans became so accustomed to comfort that they didn't even like to walk. Instead, they traveled in a hammock-like conveyance carried by slaves. If they were in a hurry, they would ride on the locals' backs to get around. The local people got fed up with their cruelty and started taking shelter in the forests. But the Europeans would chase them even to the forests, find them, and leave their bloodthirsty dogs on them. These dogs would scratch the bones of these innocents. When these native Taínos couldn't take it anymore, they started committing mass suicides. Mothers would drown their children because they could not bear to see them suffer and die of hunger. Some natives successfully managed to escape. Among them was a chief of Hispaniola named Hatui, who took some of his people to Cuba. He also had a small amount of gold in a safe place. He showed the gold to his people and said, "Look, this is the thing for which their lives are being taken." Then he threw the gold into the river. The Europeans found his tribe and captured Hatui. They tied him to a dry trunk, and a priest said to him, "Feel the cross close to your heart, and you will go to heaven." To this Hatui replied, "If heaven is the place where people like you go, then I would prefer to go to hell." After that, Hatui was burned alive. Columbus's rise was about to end. He had been favoring his 2 brothers and his chosen people, which angered the other European settlers. They inundated the Spanish court with letters. Tales of Columbus's cruelty became common in Spain, prompting the Spanish government to send their chief justice to investigate. After investigating, the judge ordered Colmbus and his 2 brothers to be sent back to Spain in chains. However, Columbus was a very clever man. During this voyage, he wrote letters to the rulers of Spain, stating that he was very close to finding gold, and if he was stopped, Spain would miss out on a lot of gold. The Spanish rulers, driven by greed, they met with Columbus in Granada. Upon his return, they allowed him to continue his search for gold, but took away his title of governor. In his final voyage, Columbus wandered around Nicaragua and Panama in search of gold, but he found none. During this time, he and his companions got stranded in Jamaica, where Columbus endured a very difficult period until help arrived some time later. By now, Columbus had grown old and sick. Harboring the desire to find gold, he returned to Spain, where he eventually passed away. Until his death, he believed that he had discovered a new route to Asia.